My name is Alex Pollock. I'm a Senior Research Fellow within the Scottish Government funded Nursing, Midwifery and Allied Health Professionals Research Unit, which is based in Glasgow Caledonian University. I'm going to give a fairly brief presentation describing how we involve people in the SPRUCE project. SPRUCE was a funded research project which updated a Cochrane systematic review relating to physiotherapy for stroke. At the end of the presentation, I will again quite briefly just reflect back on the ways that we involve people and how that meets the principles of co-production. So I had first completed and published this Cochrane systematic review in 2003. It's a review which brings together evidence about approaches to physiotherapy which are used in people who have had a stroke. When we first published it in 2003, we included 12 relevant randomized controlled trials. We then did an update in 2007 so that the review included 20 trials. Now, there was no involvement or co-production in either of these two versions. However, in the 2007 version, we encountered all sorts of problems relating to how we were bringing the evidence on the topic together. So when we started planning a further update in 2013, we knew that we had to find a solution to these problems, but we didn't really know what that solution was. Now, parallel to this, at the same time, I'd just finished a project which was generating research priorities from patients, carers and professionals. And my involvement in that project really demonstrated to me the value of involving people in a very meaningful way. And that led me to decide that I should involve stroke survivors and physiotherapists to help me make the decisions about what to do with this review update. So our aim was to update the Cochrane review, but to have involvement of stroke survivors, carers and health professionals absolutely central to what we were doing. The idea was that by involving these people, we'd end up with a review which was more clinically relevant and useful to the people who would use or benefit from that Cochrane review. So what did we actually do? We started by planning and we wrote a very detailed protocol, not a protocol for our review methods as we already had that, this was a review update, but a protocol for our methods of involving people. Now, looking back, this sounds really obvious, but I don't think this was the case when we started. And certainly in my experience, it's not common to see a systematic review protocol which is describing the methods of involving stakeholders. And if I'm entirely honest, the reason that we wrote a protocol was that we had to seek grant funding to support our review update. So it was that act of writing the funding application which forced us to think through in a lot of detail about how we were going to go about involving people. Doing this was really valuable, and I think it was a real key factor in making our project successful. So personally, I think it's really important to think about that planning in advance, to plan the methods right from this early stage. At our planning stage, we also applied for and got ethical approval. Now, ethical approval obviously isn't required for patient and public involvement, but sometimes there's this sort of blurry line about whether it's necessary or not. And in our planning, we decided that we wanted to audio record our meetings, that we wanted to use that effectively qualitative data to support the project and possibly within future publications. So we thought it was appropriate at that stage to get ethical approval. We then formed a group of people and ran a series of 2 pre-planned group meetings. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about each of those 2 stages. So forming our group, we used quite a structured and planned approach to recruit people. We created a 2-page information leaflet which told people what they'd do if they volunteered, and it described the sort of people that we were looking for and gave people details such as the dates of all the meetings that we'd have through the project. We sent that leaflet out by email to our established networks of stroke survivors, carers and physiotherapists. Just to say that there's the intervention of interest for the review was physiotherapy. We did decide that we would just include physiotherapists as our health professionals rather than any other professional groups. And then if people were interested in taking part, we asked them to contact us. And if they did contact us, we didn't then just accept everybody onto the group. We used a sort of sampling technique, much the same as you would do in qualitative research, to purposely select what we hope would be a diverse but also representative group. we aimed to have a group which was roughly half stroke survivors or carers and half physiotherapists. And for the physiotherapists, we were keen to sample so that we had some in senior roles and some in junior roles, and also people from acute rehabilitation and community settings. We aimed at the start to have a group of between 12 and 16 people and ended up with 13 in our group. So once we had these group members, we then held a series of pre-planned meetings. Each of the 3 meetings had a very clear focus, and we had decided in advance which decisions we were effectively going to hand over to the group and things that they couldn't change. The first 2 meetings took place at the beginning of the project when we were updating the review protocol, and then the 3rd meeting took place towards the end of the review when we had draft results for the review. In all 3 of the meetings, we used formal consensus decision-making techniques based on something called the nominal group technique. Now, what this meant in practice, that at each meeting, the meeting started with people agreeing some meeting rules. And this was about giving them control. So they discussed and agreed the meeting rules that they were happy with. So we didn't impose any rules on them. The group was then asked to discuss their views on a particular topic or issue. And the rules that the group had agreed between them meant that we had some really productive discussion. The group had agreed, for example, that no one person should be allowed to speak for more than 2 minutes. And they also agreed that you had to put your hand up in order to break into discussion. So everybody got a good opportunity to discuss, and we didn't have anybody particularly dominating the conversation. Once people had discussed around the topic for about 45 minutes, or certainly a pre-agreed time, then we stopped the discussion and everybody was quiet, and then they voted using a paper voting slip. And the act of having this voting slip and the voting system really made us feel that it meant that everybody had an equal voice in the decision making. The voting slips were done anonymously, so everybody was sitting with it in front of them, but we then collected them in immediately and counted them so that we could be quite transparent about the decisions that the group were making. Just to give you a little bit more of an example about how that voting worked, here's an example of how it worked in practice. What you've got on the screen there is the very first statement that the group discussed and voted on. So this is the current categories are appropriate and clinically relevant. So before the meeting at which this was discussed, we'd sent information out to the group members at which we described the current categories. And these were ways of grouping together physiotherapy interventions that were being used within the review. And then at the start of the meeting at which this was discussed, we again recapped that. We gave about a 10-minute presentation where we described the system that was currently used within the review to categorize different treatments. And we also talked about some of the challenges that we'd encountered when using them. We then handed over to the group members and they discussed the issues that arose from that for about 45 minutes. And then we stopped and we asked people to vote on this statement. We then gathered in the paper slips and counted them up, and here are the sort of collated results from the 13 people that were at the meeting. And you can see there it was quite clear that there was a majority who were disagreeing with the statement. So consensus was reached that the current categories were not appropriate. And then at our next meeting, the group members went on to reach consensus on a new way of categorizing the intervention. And I think this example really demonstrates the level of power that the group members had. They made a decision that really had a direct and very big impact on the structure of the Cochrane review that we were doing. So this is just one example. The group went on to make a whole series of decisions using the same approach. I think one of the advantages of this approach is that the numerical data that we've got, like I'm showing you on the screen now, provides a really clear way to be transparent about the decisions that have been made by the group. And we were able to then report that within the published review. So as well as having the 3 planned group meetings, we did also keep in touch with the group members throughout the review process by email or sometimes by individual telephone call. We asked people to comment on various drafts, and occasionally we asked them to, again, take a role in making various decisions to do with the review. So if I was to give you an example, towards the end of the review, when it was going through the editorial process with Cochrane, we received some comments about the wording of the title of the review, some quite subtle potential differences in how we should have the title. So what we did there was simply to put the different options into a doodle poll and ask the group members to vote, and quite quickly we're able to see that there was consensus over a particular title. At the end of the process, we did carry out some very brief evaluation. We didn't do any evaluation of the impact of the involvement on the review, but we very briefly looked at what people thought about how we had involved them. So here's a sample of some of the feedback that we got from our discussion and from a questionnaire. We only received positive feedback, which of course is great, but it was very limited in terms of what we were collecting. So now just sort of reflecting back on key principles of co-production. And of course, we didn't use the term co-production when we were planning or conducting this project, because really it was before the days when this term was in use. But I think that there are several principles of co-production which I feel are really clearly expressed within what we did. And I've just picked the 4 here that I personally think are some of the key ones that our project demonstrates. So just going through them one by one. Firstly, sharing of power. We were really explicit in handing over control for certain important decisions to do with the review. And these were decisions that had a huge impact on the structure and the content of the final review. So our group members had sole power over certain decisions, whereas us as researchers had power over certain other decisions. So there was sharing of certain parts depending on our own expertise. Alongside this, using the nominal group technique and the voting meant that everybody involved had equal power in terms of making the key decisions. So the next one there, including all perspectives and skills. We advertised widely for people to get involved, and we purposely selected people to give us a diverse group with a range of different experiences and perspectives. And I think it's important that we didn't have any requirement for people to know anything about research or systematic reviews. And when we were working together, we made a very deliberate decision with the group members that when we were communicating with them, that we would treat everyone the same. So for example, if we were sending out written information or requests for feedback, we included everybody within those emails and let people decide whether their perspectives and their skills allowed them to contribute in a meaningful way at that stage. The next one there, respecting and valuing the knowledge of all those working together. As you saw from the sort of brief evaluation slide I showed, we had feedback which told us specifically that people did feel respected and valued. And I think one of the very practical things that we did was to ask the group to come up with their own meeting rules. And those rules included things about the fact that all views mattered. And there were rules which prevented people from talking over one another. And as I've already said, our use of voting meant that when it came to the big decisions, everyone really did have a very equal say. And finally, building and maintaining relationships. So this was a new group, and the majority of the members didn't previously know us or know each other. So a practical thing again, we deliberately started each meeting with 30 minutes for buffet lunch, and we made sure that people came for the lunch and didn't just skip that part. And that really encouraged people to have some informal networking and conversation, which I think was really successful in helping build those relationships. In terms of maintaining relationships at the end of the project, we had so much enthusiasm that in terms of the sense of involvement and contribution that people had made, that we actually asked if anyone was interested in sharing that experience of co-production. And as a result of that, we went on and we got funding to support 4 of the group members to go to the UK Cochrane Symposium and actually present a workshop based on their experience of involvement. So there is a lot more information about what we did within the volume 2 of the NIHR co-production in action series, and there's also quite a lot more in that first reference that's at the top on the slide now. I just wanted to briefly add that as a result of our experience with this within this Cochrane review, we actually went on and started a project called the Active Project, which was specifically aimed at helping researchers involve people in systematic reviews. As part of that Active Project, we carried out a scoping review to find other examples of how people have been involved in systematic reviews. And that's published. The top reference in the Active Project references shows you that. And we actually also went on thinking about trying to find a framework with which you could describe the ways in which you were involving people in a review, and that's published in the bottom reference listed on the slide there. We then, working with Cochrane, pulled together all the examples that we'd found within the scoping review and using our framework into a learning resource, the link to which is at the bottom of the slide there. So if you go to the web link that's there, you end up on a page that looks like this, which is the landing page for a learning resource all about how to involve people. And within this resource, you'll find all sorts of information about other projects and the ways in which they have involved them within systematic reviews. So thank you very much for listening. Sorry I can't be part of the webinar. Thank you.